About 30 years ago, dramatic events changed the destiny of Europe. Many nations of East Europe regained independence and democracy, Soviet bloc, and then the Soviet Union fell. It gave birth to a new Europe, bigger and more united Europe. It is my honor to speak today with Florian Marcus, who is actually a German citizen but living in Estonia for a while. Mm-hmm. Actually, now you're a bond with this country because you have family here too, and you hold two master degrees, one from University College London and the other one from Tartu University in Estonia. And we have something in common with you because we were born on one and the same day. It's 20th of August 1991 when Estonia officially restored its independence, taking in account the fact that you found Estonia for yourself, beyond all options. How do you feel about this date of birth of yours?
Well, it seems like a bit of fate that you read at some point in the history books that there was a country that regained independence the same day that you were born, the same month, the same day, the same year, and back then, 8 years ago, I thought I have to visit this country, and so I did. And everything I saw, I liked. I actually came here in January for a week, in some ways the worst part of the year. Very rainy, very snowy, very dark and cold. But I thought if this is the worst that Estonia can be, then I think I would like it. And so I applied for that master's at the University of Tartu as well, and have not left since. So I'm very happy about this coincidence, because probably without that coincidence I would have visited Estonia, but I wouldn't have built up the bond that I have today.
Researching politics and also history during your studies, of course, I think that you always felt interest in recent history, mm-hmm. especially in those events which changed Germany, the fall of Berlin Wall, and so on and so forth. Can you tell that before moving to Estonia, you had one perception of those events 30 years ago, and now you have a different one because of the influence of the local narratives?
I can certainly see the big differences between the narratives in the different countries. Having lived in the UK, it's a very clear view of we liberated the rest of Europe. In Germany, it's a very conflicted view of the past. World War II, of course, and all the events that came after, reunification as well, and then the local narratives, the oppression that happened, also the collaboration that happened by some of the members of society. So you get a greater appreciation for the different angles from which history takes place every single day.
What German people mostly feel about those events now? How do you think?
About reunification?
Yeah, and also taking into account what happened in Eastern Europe, because those were connected events in a way.
I think if you would mention to most Germans the term singing revolution, they would say, what's that? Mm-hmm. Because quite frankly, it's a population of, if we look at all three Baltic states, around 5 million maybe. It was not something that concerned the Germans that massively, especially because they were right at the border of the Warsaw Pact, of the Soviet Empire and its satellites. So I guess the perception in some ways is not so strong of what happened in the Singing Revolution, the Baltic Way, and so on. But looking at reunification in Germany, what I would say is that for the first 10, 20 years, people were quite skeptical because a lot of money went from the west to the east to help rebuild the infrastructure, help rebuild the economy as well. But I think it's fair to say that for the most part, Germans see themselves as united these days, which is great.
Mm-hmm. When people were tearing down the wall and making up revolutions in different states, one of the most important words at that moment was solidarity. Mm-hmm. Many nations, and I think also, of course, East Germans awaited for solidarity from the West, for help and for the readiness to have them in the Western Hemisphere. How do you think, if you're talking now about the European Union, What are the biggest problems with this word, solidarity?
Well, I guess the two things that always clash today are solidarity and unity. So it is easy as one member state to ask for solidarity, but the question is, are you in the minority or in the majority? When we look at the turn toward illiberalism in countries like Hungary and Poland right now, and those countries would ask for solidarity, it's a very different context than it was 30 years ago. And most Western and Central European countries, Estonia included actually as well, would not support that kind of illiberal behavior. I think there is quite a lot of solidarity in the EU. We can see that through the support schemes and funds that help build up the infrastructure, that help connect the northeast, the east of the EU to the core that created the EU at the start. So I think overall it's a system that is quite inherently strong, but that will see its challenges on a daily basis, whether we're talking about the Nord Stream pipelines, whether we're talking about geopolitical questions such as the refugee crisis. But that's part for any big international group of countries, and it's the same for the EU.
Mm-hmm. Germany is seen rightfully as one of the most influential and, of course, rich countries of Europe. And here in Eastern and Northeastern Europe, people are kind of, decided that because Germany have this exceptionally strong understanding of the recent past, being divided between two, and having also this national socialist experience, so Germany must kind of more understand what we feel about recent history here in Eastern Europe, about Russia, about dangers of what we see as parallels from recent history. Is it true, like that Germany is much more kind of empathic and solidar with the Eastern Europe because of this bond of the past?
I think in some ways yes, and in some ways no. When we talk about being a conquered people, Germans were some of the nations that, or part of the nations that occupied Eastern Europe through different times of the past, whether we're talking about the sort of crusaders and so on, or whether we're talking about more recent history. So perhaps in that way it is very hard to relate to that, and maybe countries in Eastern Europe may feel they have more in common with the Netherlands and Belgium, that have also sometimes stood between France and Germany, just from a geopolitical standpoint. In other ways, I think that there is certainly an experience to be shared. When we think about East Germany and the kind of oppression that those people have gone through, the Stasi, as we all know, was one of the more meticulous government secret services in that way. So I certainly think there is a shared memory there, and we can see those conferences about memory, about remembering those shared experiences, and I think there is a lot of overlap there across Eastern Europe.
And interesting that if we're talking about the narratives of remembrance of the victims of totalitarianism and authoritarianism, then Germany stands just again on the borderline, because, well, basically we can say that Eastern Europe is thinking more about how to investigate and research the crimes of communist regimes, because it was about one half of the century. Those are tens of millions of people. So this is the most important dramatic part of the recent history's legacy. And the West, of course, have experience, well, mostly or only with National Socialism or with different kinds of neo-fascist regimes, even Spain and Portugal, and of course Italy have this other experience, other form of totalitarianism or authoritarianism. So it means that when those two kind of two parts are trying to discuss what are the nature of totalitarian regimes, then they sometimes there sometimes clashes or tensions. Maybe probably this is also a quite huge call for the solidarity, because if people from other side think that the sufferings of the other side is are not so huge because ABCD, it's bad. How do you see this problem? Is it kind of growing or decreasing, or?
I think it will decrease over time simply as generations, slowly move on. But exactly what you described, I can also see within German society where, for example, people in East Germany would say, let's investigate more the communist crimes. And then West Germans would be afraid that if we focus too much on left-wing crimes, we seem like we are Nazi apologists or something like that, which is obviously not the case. You can investigate the crimes of both extreme political spectrum sides. So that is a problem, both in an international context and in the case of Germany, because we had two of them. It's also an internal dispute to an extent. So yeah, I think that's a challenge. I hope that it will slowly decrease, though.
Switching the topic, I would like to talk a bit about political ideologies. And this is straightforward to your subject. Of course, I and you, we don't have personal experience from the time when the wall was teared down.
We just missed it. Yeah.
We just missed it. A couple of years or maybe even months. The form which conservatism, liberalism and social democracy had at that time, now I think changed a lot. If I'm talking about those three main political mainstreams, how do you see, did they dramatically change during the last 30 years? And how would you describe the main values of those three ideologies today?
I think that the definitions themselves have not changed significantly, but the way that parties use them or shift alongside that spectrum has changed quite drastically. We have in Germany a conservative party that tries to be, is in their slogan, the middle ground, the center of the German political spectrum, because parties have developed into these so-called catch-all parties. They're trying to get the middle ground of society. If we talk about the definitions, I think that liberalism used to stand more for general equality in front of the law, also economic freedom, rather unregulated or deregulated economy, and what we can see these days is that there is a much stronger shift towards sort of social liberalism, where you would say it's not just about having the right, having the same rights in front of the law, but also the same access, the same sort of ability to use resources. So I think that's a small change, which I personally would welcome. Actually, it makes society more inclusive. Social democracy, I would say, has stayed largely the same. It's just gained more and more mainstream appeal. We can see that. Effectively, the US is the last industrialized country that is still debating on whether we should have a social welfare system or not. But the rest of the world has largely moved on. And the third one was towards authoritarianism, or
no, I mean liberalism, conservatism, and
yeah. I think conservatism is precisely because those conservative parties moved towards a sort of catch-all approach. You see that the right spectrum of those catch-all parties is heading towards a more extreme right-wing direction, whether it's the Alternative for Germany in Germany, or whether it's EKRE in Estonia or other countries. We can see that there is a certain separation from those traditional parties toward a populist approach, and they've seen some success. The question is, how long will that hold up? But that's always the case. If you have big societal developments, the refugee crisis, I would point out as one of them. You will always have people that are, that are starting a backlash against too progressive movements, and then they will sort of balance themselves out over time.
And interesting that those same people who were pro-unification of Germany, who were tearing down different walls, mental walls and physical walls, all around Central and Eastern Europe, and kind of being a bit being a fan of the free world.
Yeah.
Now changed a lot. Many of those people started to vote for parties who appeal to other emotions and who actually want to close borders and have more protectionism and so on. What's your idea why this shift happened?
I think there are some very subjective reasons and some very legitimate reasons. So some more subjective reasons would be that you can be a white German fighting for a free and united Germany, but you don't want people who look a bit different or who bring another religion or another language into your country. You fought for a free Germany, remember. So is that a bit closed-minded? Yes, but you can understand, that it doesn't necessarily go against their own values or ideology. And but that's just an emotional level. The second level, I think there is some legitimacy to looking at how international organizations developed. So if you were in favor of a free and united whatever home country, and all of a sudden your home country is joining the EU, is joining NATO, and so on, and you didn't get occupied. You're still self-governing, but you are following the political trend lines of a much bigger organization that you on your own cannot steer. And if we, for example, talk about NATO having had a sort of identity crisis in the 1990s, the main idea was defense against communism. Once communism largely collapsed in the immediate surroundings, what do as a defense organization? And that's when NATO started being active in Kosovo, being active in Afghanistan, and so on. And I can also see some arguments there saying that this was not what we voted for 10, 15 years ago, 2004 for Estonia. And so there would also be some disappointment there.
Talking about the European foreign policy, one of the hot topics for a while is European Union and the United States. That's close partners from one side, but from other sides, people say that, of course, those relations are cooling down, and there are more and more problems. And in some European states, the perception of America changed to quite negative. How do you see this process? Is it dangerous for European Union as a economical and political power to not have the United States by its side anymore?
I think that the partnership between the United States and Europe as a whole will not deteriorate that quickly. Even if there might be one or two presidencies where people were not sure about the future of the relation, I think over the next century we're pretty safe unless someone does something very, very silly. I am personally very much in favor of greater European self-determination and independence in terms of trade policy, defense policy, and so on. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And we can see that actually already in past conflicts there have been disagreements between European and American leaders. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you have, for example, Germany being one of the larger economies in Europe disagreeing with the US about Iraq or about Afghanistan, and choosing not to contribute with soldiers or anything else, then I think that's perfectly okay. It's okay to have disagreements on an international stage, and so the EU should build up the capacities to really have an independent policy. This requires, number one, greater collaboration between the different European member states, and it also requires some structural changes underneath. The famous American question was, when I want to talk about foreign policy of the EU, who do I call? And that is still a question that, to an extent, we have a high commissioner, but we need a foreign minister. So stuff like that still has to be solved.
But at the same time, of course, you just mentioned that you are in favor of bigger autonomy and also in defense issues. The main sentiment here near the borderline with Russia is that the real guarantee and real readiness to intervene comes at the moment only from America. And the problem with European big states is that they are too, too afraid of being military active. It's not only about Germany. So the problem is main problem is in the issue that actually Europe doesn't know how to defend itself against big threats, and when diplomacy doesn't work anymore. Is it a problem?
I think it's a very fair criticism because, quite frankly, the US is at least in my opinion, the only remaining superpower right now that has geopolitical interests in every single part of the world.
And which is democracy.
Which is a democracy as well, yes. So it's understandable that the US would have a higher degree of interest in any conflict that would arise around the world. The second issue is that Europeans overall have a very, in the last 100 years or so, have had a very difficult relationship with war. If you have the war to end all wars, World War I, and then there came a second one, you're sort of getting a bit tired of the whole thing, I guess. So I understand European reluctance to engage in these military conflicts, and I understand why countries such as the Baltic states that are on the border with countries like Russia, that they would primarily look to the US for support in that way. But I think that's exactly where the EU has to step up as well, to say we cannot just depend on American firepower. We have to have our own defense policy, and we see developments in that direction. So the sort of shared purchasing agreements, the battle groups that are being built up between different member states, I think that's the right direction to go.
If you talk about united foreign policy, European as one, what are the biggest calls for this European foreign policy during this century?
I don't have a crystal ball, but something that will remain a challenge in one way or another is migration. Whether it is, at the start it was the Syrian refugee crisis. It very quickly became the Mediterranean question. It will be Russia will just for geopolitical reasons always be next door. That's just a fact that you don't want to change, so this will be an eternal question as well, and I think something where only the EU can solve things would be Eastern Partnership. So what about accession of Ukraine? What about accession of the Caucasus? Are we open for those countries? If not, why? Based on what? On values, on economics, and so on. So these are questions that are going to keep the European Parliament and the different institutions very busy for the foreseeable future.
How about climate change? Do you see Europe doing enough?
No country on earth is doing enough. I drove to this interview today by car because public transport connection to my village, which is only 5 kilometers outside the capital, is good, but it could be better. But I'm driving with an electric car. But then electric cars, they also get batteries from Africa and so on, and that's very dirty. So there are a lot of supply chains that have to be completely rethought, and I don't see a single country that is there. We see that companies and governments alike are thinking about carbon offset, planting trees, and all of these things, which is a good start. But there is still plenty of work to do. What I would say is that the EU acting as a united front gives it a lot more negotiation power around the world to sort of put the issue on the agenda. And if we have countries like China not following some of the agreements, when we have countries like the US leaving the Paris Climate Accord for a few years, then we have to look to Europe, because who else is gonna make play their part in solving the problem?
Do you feel yourself as a European?
On a secondary level, yes. I think if you would ask most people, where are you from? They will tell you Germany, Estonia, whatever. Because this is the country that we grew up in. This is the language that we grew up with, the culture, the everything. And this is, that's part of who we are. But on a secondary level, I very, very certainly feel European.
I ask this question with the purpose. Actually, are you able to define what are the values of European citizen? I can say quite a lot about Estonian citizen, but how about European citizen?
I would say that there is a great respect for peace, maybe sometimes too much, but there is a great respect for peace. There is mostly a great respect for democratic values. Do unto others as you want others to do unto you. So I think there's also the value of liberalism, broadly speaking, social liberalism, that we should have support networks in place to make sure that no one has to live on the streets, that no one has to suffer hunger and so on. So I think those values are very important. Free speech is also quite strongly protected. There is a discussion to be had about the US model and the European model, where I think we're all still finding the balance, but I think those would be the European values that are true for most.
Are they all healthy, or there are erosions of some of them?
I think the biggest question right now is not about democracy, but it's about free speech and privacy.
Why?
We see, and this has been brought about not necessarily by populists or anything, but also by private companies. If a company like Facebook or Google, if they have such immense power around the world, that they can shut down discourse today with a mouse click, that is a lot of responsibility. And governments have to, and the companies themselves have to figure out who manages free speech. Can free speech be managed? If yes, should it be managed? We see that there are some European institutions thinking about certain buzzwords that should be banned or censored or something, or only accessible to 18 plus or whatever, and those are very tricky questions that we have to solve over the next few years.
Since we're slowly heading towards the end of our conversation, one a bit more personal question too. Do you believe that your kids will live in a healthier, richer, safer Europe than you do at the moment?
Yes, I hope so. Those are two answers. Number one is I hope so, but number two, I think so. Yes, we can see an ever-growing integration of the different parts of Europe, economically speaking, socially, culturally speaking, which I think overall is a positive development. I think that if I look at the past two generations, just parents and grandparents, that I am a lot more open, a lot more tolerant, more educated. I've had the chance to go to university, which my parents sadly did not. So I think that these are positive things, and I don't see any big structural reason why that should not be true for my children as well. We'll see where it goes, but it should be okay.
Will Europe be more federalist at that time?
I would expect it to be more centralized. I would personally be very happy about that, because coming from the e-government area, I can see that federalization has some advantages for sure, but it also means that there is a very fragmented landscape of how things work. A very simple example would be that in Estonia, we have an e-prescription. You show up with your ID card to any pharmacy in the country, you get your medicine. You go to Germany, doesn't work anymore. You go to Spain, doesn't work anymore. So there are good reasons for a greater centralization. Of course, we have to be very careful that we don't accidentally delete national cultures around Europe, that we don't accidentally say, there is now a lingua franca, it's English, and all the other languages can basically go to die over the next 100 years. So we have to find a very careful balance there. But overall, some more centralization would be useful for Europe, I think.
And the last one, cultural. You are kind of a really good example of internal European cultural integration. You come from, you were living most of your life in Germany, and you had education in London. You come from a huge culture which doesn't think about how to survive as a language or as a culture. So different from a country of 1.3 million. As Estonia is, we all the time ask our questions, will we be here as we are now culturally, even if in 50 years, taking into account the influence of English language and so on. Did it kind of change your cultural identity that you moved here?
So this is something that I have a very strong opinion on. I am not very worried about cultural assimilation and linguistic assimilation for a very simple reason. As long as it is done voluntarily, let's put it that way. We can see, and I'm sure you can confirm this, that the Estonian youth uses more and more English words. Not because they're being forced, not because they're being taught at school that this is the right way to say it, but they find it interesting, they find it cool.
Even a new language, Estonglish.
Estonglish, exactly.
It means an absolute mixture of Estonian and English words.
And in German we have Denglish. So that's, it's exactly the same direction. I think that as long as it happens organically over time and voluntarily, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There are hundreds of languages around Europe that have gone extinct, where maybe some words have survived in the bigger language. I come from a region in Germany that historically spoke Low German, which sounds like a mixture of German and Dutch. I learned maybe 1 or 2 poems in Low German at primary school, but that's about it. And those languages they go away, but the culture doesn't have to go away. And it does not mean exclusion, rather it means that more people can talk to each other on the same terms. We see similar developments in Estonia, where Estonian is a small language, but Seto and Võro are even smaller. They will also go extinct at some point. I think it's very fair to say. Of course, it is sad if you think about it right in this moment, but in 100 years, I think most people will be okay, and most people will feel integrated into Estonian or European society. So I think this is something that just happens, and nothing to be too worried about. And German, in the very long run, will probably also go away.
And will be replaced with what?
Whether it's English over the next 500 years or Mandarin over the next 1,000, I don't know.
truly hope that the language of Goethe will not disappear from the face of Earth. Well, Florian, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.